Okay. Excuse me. Today is also Martin Luther King Sunday, and I want to say a little bit about that today. And part of the reason why I do this is people forget that it's Martin Luther King Sunday. But part of it, I want to emphasize that this is Martin Luther King Sunday, not Martin Luther King Day. Now that's a minor distinction, right? But it is to say that the real world out there doesn't have any sense of Martin Luther King's religious side. There's two things I want to say today. One is that I want to emphasize, and I'll do this in all my comments, you'll hear it again and again, that when you hear someone out there on CBS or NBC, ABC, Fox, all the rest, they'll always talk about this wonderful guy who died a long time ago and set a lot of people free, and his name was Dr. Martin Luther King. There's nothing wrong with that, he was. However, what I like to focus on is that he was actually Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He wasn't some social worker. He didn't work for AAA and go rescue people on the side of the road somewhere. He was an ordained Christian. And he preached from the Bible. He spoke from the Bible. He lectured from the Bible. I'm going to read a piece of a speech that he gave one time to some sanitation workers. And he quotes the Bible all the way. This is not just one more secular guy. He's there because Jesus Christ told him to be there. And don't ever forget that, no matter what everybody tries to. There's something in the water today that people are just not allowed to mention the religiosity of someone, and that's just not fair. So once a year, I'll talk about the religion of Martin Luther King to remind everybody, nobody cares outside of this wall, but to remind everybody that he comes from our roots. He was an ordained Baptist minister. Some of you who have Baptist roots might appreciate that particular thing, but he was Christian first. That's one thing I wanted to say. And the second thing you'll hear me doing today, and I think people need to hear this, and one of the reasons why I bring this up every year, is that the things that I'm going to be talking about are within the lifetime of maybe half of the people here, that you were adults and cognizant and saw some of it on TV. I did, and I'll tell you that later on. And some of this stuff that they went through back in those days, the 50s, 60s, is horrific. It would remind you of the things that Bashar al-Assad did to his own people over in Syria. Some of this torture of other American citizens that went on and on and on is not very far away. We're just one or two civil rights bills away from the same kind of oppression that we used to do some years ago. So I just want to remind people of that too, when we're looking down our nose at folks in Guatemala and El Salvador or the Middle East or Indonesia. You know, human beings are sinful. You give us a rope and we'll put it around somebody's neck. And here's some stories of how that was worked out. Now, I don't want to say, by the way, some people do, that the civil rights era is over with. Because, you know, racism is alive and well today, still is, and voter suppression is still going on. All that's true. But I'm going to show you an era when it was brutal, when it was harsh. And that's mainly what I'm going to be up to today. Let's talk about King and the era in general. Most of you know he was actually born in Atlanta. His father was a minister, but he went to different colleges and universities, ending up in Boston University, as a matter of fact, working on his PhD in religion. And while he was up there, by the way, he met his wife, he met Corita, and she was a music student at the New England Conservatory. And they met, actually a blind date, someone fixed them up together. And I always like to tell this story, he told it himself, and I thought it was kind of cute, that neither one of them was comfortable meeting the other, because he wasn't sure about her, because he had heard that she's not very religious. And he thought, you know, I just can't really get on with a woman that isn't very religious. Just isn't going to happen. She wasn't very comfortable to him because she'd heard he was too short. And later on, they got together, they loved each other, and he said, you know, I changed my mind. She grew, and she's one of the most spirit-led people that I know, and that's wonderful. But she said, I didn't change my mind, he always stayed short. So they got married, they moved back to Atlanta, and stayed with Mommy and Daddy for a while, and then he finally, in 1954, in January, got a call from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and called him there to go to a church. And he went down on May 16th. Remember that date. because May 16th, he preached his first sermon, a candidating sermon, they call it, and the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And on May 17th, the very next day, is when the Supreme Court made its decision about Brown versus the Board of Education, the one that said you can't segregate in schools. Now, that's significant, the very next day. And then he started in that church in November of the rest of that year, and 1 year later, almost to the day, on December 1st, is when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery on a bus. And the history of the world as we know it changed. That was a major, momentous thing. Let me tell you a couple things about that. It's kind of interesting. Some of this you know, some of you may not know. The buses in Montgomery were mainly an African-American enterprise. That is to say, 79% of the people who rode the buses back in those days were black. And that's because they didn't have any cars, and so they got around by the buses, okay? However, all of the drivers were white, and you weren't allowed to have a black driver, and all of the buses were segregated. That is to say, the first 5 or 10 seats in the front were only for white people, and all of the rest of the seats back in the back were only for black people, and you couldn't mix those up. Most of us know that. However, the interesting thing that most people don't know, which is that Rosa Parks actually was sitting in the, I hate to use this term, the colored section, but she actually sat in the colored section, and the right and proper section. But there was another rule that said that if a white guy came in the bus and it was all filled up in the front, he could go to anybody that was black and tell them to get up and stand for the rest of the trip, and he could take their seat. And if she said, well, I'm sitting here and I'm old, it doesn't make any difference. White people get to sit wherever they want to. And so she was actually in that place. Some of the stories they tell about those buses are amazing. For example, if a black person got on the bus, they would pay their money and token, get the token, but they couldn't walk down the aisle in front of all the white people to get to the colored section. They had to get off the bus, get out, walk down to the edge, and get back onto the bus again in the second door, because they're not allowed to walk in front of white people. And as you probably could imagine, it wasn't a few times that they would get on the bus, and if there wasn't anybody back of them, they'd buy their ticket and get off, and if that was the last one, and you start to walk down to the side, and the bus driver would drive off, leaving them behind. They called that a joke back in those days, just because they thought it was funny. So one time there was a gentleman who was trying to get on the bus, and he was blind, and he was fumbling because of that, and his cane got in the way and all these kind of problems. And he's taking too much time, so the bus driver just closed the door on him and took off with his leg caught in the door and dragged him for 2 blocks to the next stop, and opened the door, and he fell down on the pavement bleeding with a broken leg. And he got his new passengers onto the bus, and he drove away and left him there bleeding on the road. Another time someone walked up and paid the fee, and one of the little tricks that the bus drivers would frequently do is they'd take your money for the ticket, and then they would pocket the money, and then they'd say, now you owe me the money for the ticket. And he said, I just paid you. He said, no, I don't see the money. What do you mean? No, I just paid you for the ticket. That went on often. So one time there was someone who was arguing with a bus driver saying he did actually pay for the ticket, and a policeman walked up and said, what's going on? And he said, well, this guy's arguing with me about the fee. And he says, you're not supposed to argue with a white man. So he took his gun out and shot him and killed him in the street because he was arguing over a 15-cent bus ticket with a white man. So buses were not friendly people. And Rosa Parks worked as a seamstress downtown in Montgomery. She got off work, and she was tired, and it was December 1, so she went to the downtown stores and shopped for 2 hours to buy presents for her kids and her grandkids. And she had all this stuff, and she was exhausted by around 7 o'clock. The bus came along. She stood for the bus. She got on the bus, went back to the colored section of the bus, sat down. Lo and behold, it filled up the front. A guy came down to her and said, you need to move. And she said, I've had a long day, and I am tired, and I'm not going to move. Now, I should say, by the way, it wasn't just tiredness. She also used to work for the NAACP during the period of time when the decision came down about the Brown versus Board of Education integrating schools. So back in the back of her mind, she said later on in an interview, she said, I was also thinking that if it's good enough for those kids, it's good enough for me. Come on. So she didn't get up. And all HELL broke loose. You can imagine the entire city exploded Now, if they had done that for some radical Black Panther communist something, it might not have been a big deal. But a grandmotherly Rosa Parks, it just hit the fan in ways that it had never had before. All of the black side of town jumped up and screamed and said, let's go after them. And all the white side of town jumped up and grabbed their guns and their baseball bats, and they said, let's go after them. And they were going to have a major scene. So all the ministers got together, and they organized this little group about the Betterment Society or something like that. And they said, we got to do something fast. And they said, let's get somebody. Who do we know that's young and green and naive and doesn't know Montgomery very well and doesn't want to get involved and won't make a scene, and someone that we can control? Who do you think we can do that? And someone said, oh, I know. There's this kid that just moved to town. His name is King something or other. And he just got married. He's got a little baby. He's got a whole lot to lose. He won't do much. He'll make a nice speech. He'll look good in front of the camera. And then we can go back to the way things are. So they called him in. And by the way, King initially said no, for all those reasons. You know, the wife, the baby, the new. He said, you're right. But they talked him into it, and he did it. And bless his heart, he didn't just give a speech and say, go home. He started organizing a boycott of the buses. Remember I said that 79% of all the people on the buses were black? Imagine if you pull all those off the buses. It just collapsed the busing industry in Montgomery completely. They arranged to have a carpooling. You know, some say, I've got a car, I can take 3 people. Okay, you drive over there. I've got a station wagon, I can take 5. Okay, well, you go over there. And they arranged all around. I've got a pickup, I can take a bunch. And they did the entire bus routes of loaned cars. And they did that for months and months and months. And they arrested people and they beat people. I mean, the boycotters didn't. The police arrested them and beat people. During that period of time, they were putting sugar in the gas tanks of some of the cars. They were throwing Molotov cocktails onto the front porches of houses. It was a nightmare. It got terrible. They went to court and they won. You cannot segregate buses, and the town appealed it. They went to federal court and they won. You cannot segregate buses, and they appealed it. And they won and they appealed it. Went on and on. It got tiresome and tiresome. Finally, after a lot of time, King about gave up. He himself had been called and threatened, and his house had been bombed a couple of times. He was terrified. And one night, 2 o'clock in the morning, sound asleep, phone rings. He answers the phone, and the guy got on the phone and called him every single name that you can imagine, screamed at him in the phone, and said, I'm going to kill you. Not only am I going to kill you, I'm going to torture your wife and your little baby unless you get off of this and let us go back to the way that things were. Well, he couldn't sleep very well after that, so he went downstairs and made a pot of coffee, and he sat there at the kitchen table and he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed, and said, Lord Jesus, what on earth can I do? He wrote all this down, by the way, in a lovely book, if you want to ever read it, called Strive Towards Freedom. And he started hearing God speak to him. Actually, he started hearing Jesus speak to him. And he said a lot of things. But the thing that was most important is this. He said, don't ever give up. 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 He filled out a whole page of nothing but that phrase. That was repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. So King, he turned off the coffee pot and put things away and went back to bed. And the next morning, he held a press conference and started off again. And by the way, the coward who called him never did anything to his wife and kids. He was just a coward that was talking on the phone. November 16th, they were in court again. And this time, they were in court for causing a disturbance of the peace. And the fine for that was going to be $15,000, disturbance of the peace, for people who didn't want to give money to somebody to get on a bus. Because they didn't buy the bus ticket, they would be fined $15,000. And it was a dark, dark time. Everybody had been arrested a number of times. King went to jail. He went to jail one time. They caught him driving down the street going 5 miles over the speed limit. And they took him to jail for that. And they charged him $20,000 that his friend Ralph Abernathy had to bail him out of jail for $20,000 to get him home again for 5 miles over the speed limit. And he got home, and all these things were weighing on his shoulders. And then they went to court on this thing about disturbing the peace, and they lost. the judge came down and said, yes, you need to pay the $20,000 for the disturbing the peace. And he looked up and it's 12 o'clock, they're going to take a break in the court. And in his book he says that, it said 12 o'clock morning on the wall, but it felt like 12 midnight in my soul. I thought, we can't go on. It's getting to be winter. We can't continue this. We're all tired. We're not sure if it can happen. On that break, on the hour of lunch from 12 to 1, down the hall came a guy from the Associated Press, a journalist, and in his hand, he had the fax. This is back when they used to send faxes around, But he didn't have an email attachment. He had a fax that he'd gotten that said that the Supreme Court had found in their favor and segregation of buses was against the Constitution. They won. They won. And it changed everything. 2 months later, they actually hired a black bus driver, in fact. 2 months later, everything just was a different world because of that, because they hung in there. Now, that didn't change everything, but that changed a lot. Let me move on to a couple of other things that happened. From there, King became famous. He was on the cover of magazines, he was meeting with the president. It became a big, big deal. And so he decided, this is important. I need to spend more time on this. So he moved back to Atlanta, where I told you his father had a church. Moved back to Atlanta, and his father offered him a job as the associate pastor of this big, huge church that the father had, right? And he would work part-time in the church and part-time to work on civil rights stuff. Now, only a daddy would do that, but bless his heart, he was able to. So he could work in the church and he could do some things part-time, but he could also work on civil rights things and do stuff there part-time. And he did that. By then, he had left that church. He left that in 1959. And I want to tell you something about 1960, 1961. Remember the sit-ins? Those of you who are of some age might recognize that term. The sit-ins began in 1960. And I want a little tiny piece where I tie into that, and I wanted to share this with you. There's a guy named James Lawson. He's actually from Ohio originally, brilliant guy, black guy. And he actually worked for an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. You ever heard of that? I don't think they're around any longer, but they were a peacekeeping pacifist organization back in the day, right? And he also was a Peace Corps volunteer over in India, and he worked over there for a while, and he studied nonviolent resistance, the Mahatma Gandhi stuff. Came back home again, and he began the sit-ins. Now, sit-ins are where you have these all-white lunch counters in a lot of places, and black people would go and try to sit down at a white lunch counter. Eek, scary, and they'd get arrested for it. He started that, and he built into that the kind of Martin Luther King, Gandhi nonviolence philosophy. Did. So Martin Luther King heard about him, and they went and met for a while. He says, you need to come down here. We need you in the South. Now, I don't want to say too much about that because racism is alive and well in the North as well as the South. But the harsher parts of racism was in the South. We need you down here. So he came down to Nashville, Tennessee, and he enrolled in the Vanderbilt Divinity School in Nashville, Tennessee, and worked on a PhD. Now, here's where he and I have so much in common. Number one, we just happen to be born on the same day. Now, he's 20 years earlier, but hey, it's the same day. September 2nd, just in case you want to put it on your calendar and you're going to send me a card. And some of you forgot to buy me a present last year. I'm not just saying, if you want to know when it is. And second thing is, we both went to Vanderbilt Divinity School, which I think is kind of cool. And third thing is, we both had the same topic for our dissertation, which is called systematic theology. I'm not going to go into what all that means, but we had the same topic for the thing we wrote about. Now, his was much better than mine. His was published. Mine's in a trash can somewhere. But nonetheless, it was a nice thing. And I'll lift that. I think that's my only contact with the guy. He started organizing these sit-ins in Nashville, and 500 or 600 college students would go and sit on these things, on these things. And he organized all that. Of course, they all got arrested, and they're going to jail, and all HELLs breaking out again. Got to be a big scene. Interesting thing is that the university, Vanderbilt University, my alma mater, wonderful, tremendous, fine university, they threw him out. They kicked him out of the school because he was organizing on the side. Now, in their defense, let me say that within a week, the entire divinity school faculty and staff resigned and left the school. Within 2 weeks, 80% of all of the rest of Vanderbilt University resigned and walked. So there was just a couple of guys who were, cleaning the streets after that. And that was all there was left of this esteemed institution. So the administration had to call up to this guy, James Lawson, and say, we made a little bit of a mistake. I'm so sorry about that. I'm sorry I called you all those names. And could you come back again? And I'm glad they did. And he stayed there and continued. Martin Luther King himself got involved in these sit-ins back when he was in Atlanta. And that's kind of an interesting story. And he and 2 or 3 other people went down. They sat in the lunch counters, and these whites-only lunch counters. They got arrested. And they had 5 or 6 of them got arrested. And they were in jail. And here's what happened, though. They were in jail for 2 or 3 days, till finally someone paid a bail or something and got him out of jail, except for King. He was the only one. He was left behind. You know why? Remember that 5 miles over the speed limit ticket thing? Come to find out, they didn't let him off the hook for that ticket. They just let him out on parole. So they looked that up, and they thought since he had moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Atlanta, Georgia, he had broken his parole on this horrible crime that he had committed. So he had jumped his parole. And so they gave him 4 months in the Reidsville State Penitentiary, hard labor, breaking up rocks with chains around your neck. That's what he got for this 5 miles over the speed limit ticket that he got. So he was the only one. Well, as it turns out, history's funny. I've often thought that story about James Lawson is funny. He didn't mean to go to Nashville. He went there to the school. Martin Luther King talked him into going to school, talked him into going to the divinity school, and all this happened, and the school exploded. After it happened, the school put out this week-long mission and service day in his honor, you know what I mean? So the whole school could take a week off in spring every year as long as they would work on some mission project. I came in 1972, and that was the gift. And I went down a friend of mine and we went down to Nicaragua, Managua, Nicaragua, where they had just had this horrible earthquake and destroyed the city. We went down, we rebuilt roads during that time. We also organized a bunch of preachers to get together to have an ecumenical road building development project, which became Church World Service. That's the organization we give all of our money to for overseas development and things like that. So it's interesting how this guy conversation with King, talked him into going to Nashville, had the big blow up. They set up the thing for the school, which sent, they started this thing for this week-long time to work in mission, which took me into that, which helped establish the Nicaraguan Church World Service Organization. And by the way, some of you know I've been leading delegations to Nicaragua and Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico and Peru and Colombia for the last 30 years because of that. It's funny how those things trickle down, isn't it? Another one is that when King was in jail, someone named Bob Spofford, who was an aide to this young kid from Massachusetts, who was a senator, who thought he wanted to run for president, went to him and said, you know, John, there's this mess going on down in Atlanta. You need to get involved in that. And John Kennedy said, I can't get involved in that because that's a landmine. That may go off and blow me up. I want to run for president. He was actually in the middle of the campaign. I'm running for president. If it went the wrong way, I'd lose everything. And Spofford said, yeah, but it's important. So Kennedy said, all right. He called up the judge that had sentenced King to this time in jail, right? Talked him out of it. Got him to rescind that particular judgment and got King out of jail. And he called King, and the two of them chatted back and forth. And when Martin Luther King got out of jail, he stood on the steps at the Reidsville State Penitentiary and had a press conference. And he said a number of things, one of which was, thank you to John F. Kennedy in Massachusetts because he is responsible for my getting out. That's all he said. But the media covered that. It was in all the papers, all the television, all the rest of that, right? And then the election was 2 weeks later, and more blacks came out to vote in that election than in any other time in the history of the United States. And Kennedy won by 100,000 votes. So you wonder, would life on planet Earth be different if that little thing had not happened? if Kennedy had said no, for example, or his aide hadn't talked him into it. Life is full of these little ricochets, isn't it, that we don't always know anything about, and they just happen. I want to scoot along. After that, there was a terrible things that happened once again in Montgomery. A couple of them happened in Selma. You know some of those stories. There was good times, there was bad times. He became internationally famous. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was Man of the Year on Time magazine's cover and all the rest of that. Also some sad times. Some of the work didn't work out well at all. I'm going to skip all of that and move to the very, very end. And by the way, in doing so, I'm going to leave out some of the gory, bloody beatings and fights and slaughters that went on. Just trust me, it was a horrible, horrible season. But then toward the end, King began to change. He began to broaden his vision of what the kingdom of God ought to be all about. And he stopped being someone who was a civil rights leader. He said, this isn't for blacks and whites. This isn't even just for blacks and whites and reds and yellows. This isn't just for browns. He said that the world itself is just so broken right now, and poor white people have more in common with poor black people than they do with the wealthy guys at the top that are pulling the strings and making them poor. So he organized, you may recall this, in 1968, he organized a Poor People's Campaign. They were going to go back to Washington. I didn't even tell you about him going to Washington and giving the I Have a Dream speech. I don't have time to get into all that. But he was going to have another campaign to go back to Washington. This was going to have Native American Indians in it. It was going to have Hispanics in it. It was going to have poor whites in it. It was going to have poor blacks in it. They all were going to be together trying to take in that vision that Isaiah had, that I read to you last week, of all gathering on God's holy mountain, and there's enough in the kingdom for everyone to go around. To try to bring in that vision that Jesus had when he would talk to the Samaritans, and he would talk to the sinners, and he'd talk to the tax collectors, talk to the diseased. He would bring them all in together and love them, accepting, and all that great vision that the Apostle Paul had in Galatians, where he says there's neither Jew nor non-Jew, there's no slaves, there's no free, there's no men, there's no women, we're all one in Christ our Lord. King said, that's the vision of the kingdom. That's the vision for the United States of America. And so he started organizing toward that vision. However, right in the middle of that, there was a garbage strike in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details. Just trust me, the sanitation workers in Memphis were treated awful. Treated awful. They really were. And I can give you jot and tittle later, but it was terrible. And so James Lawson, bless his heart, was the minister of a big, remember him? The first part of the story, the guy at Vanderbilt? James Lawson, bless his heart, was now by this time serving a big mega church in Memphis. And he started organizing these little strikes against the sanitation company, about the sanitation workers. It wasn't getting anywhere. So he said, I tell you what, let me call my friend Martin and see if he'll come down and give a couple of speeches. That should help it. That should help it. So they said, okay. So he called Martin on the phone. Martin is getting ready to do this Poor People's Watch. He's busy, and he's got the flu and doesn't feel good, and he can fly all the way down there, give one speech, and come all the way back again. Just didn't think he could get himself up for that. He talked him into it anyway. So James Lawson talked Martin Luther King into coming down to Memphis, Tennessee. He came down, and by the way, Ralph Abernathy came down with him, and a lot of other people. They all came down. Andy Young was there. Jesse Jackson was there. All those names that you recognize from later on, they all came down and they converged on Memphis, Tennessee. And there was going to be a rally before the big march the next day, and they wanted King to come and speak at the rally. He says, I can't. I'm just gone. I can barely stand up. I'm so sick. I just can't do it. So he sent Ralph over in his place. And Ralph went over there, pouring rain, got inside, and there's thousands of people. This big, huge mega church, thousands of people there. They're all wanting to hear King. And so he got on the phone, he says, Martin, can you do it? Can you come? And King said, I don't think so. He said, they really, 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 really want to hear from you and not from me. So he rallied, took a cab, got over there, walked up the steps, again, pouring rain, walked in looking horrible, feeling worse, and Lawson said, there he is, bring him up to the front. Everybody applauded, and he came up to the front and put him behind the pulpit and said, speak. He had no speech, nothing to say. And he looked there for a long time, and he started talking. And he came up with, and I'm going to read you a piece of this actually, came up with what we now call the I've been to the mountaintop speech. And a portion of it is very prescient. He said to them, I don't know what will happen now, We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I have been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. You know, like anybody, I'd like to have a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And it's God allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over the mountain, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing anybody. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The next day, April 4, 1968, they check into the Lorraine Motel. By the way, I've been to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. You ought to go there sometime. It's an interesting little museum today. Check into the motel. The next morning, his brother Ad, A.D. were his initials, they called him Ad, he came by and they played a little trick on Mom because their voices sounded just exactly alike. So they both would call her and she'd have to guess which one was speaking. It's a kid's thing. They did that. And they checked off and on because Andrew Young was out checking to see if he can get the papers to make the march that they were going to do legal. And Jesse Jackson came in, he reported on trying to get all the young people in the area, see if they would be marshals to make this thing work. They did some business, they made some phone calls, they wrote some letters, and then at around 5 o'clock, they were told that they were going to go down for dinner, and they were going to have dinner over at James Lawson's house. And there was going to be a guy who was going to be playing the piano there, and he drove the car up at 5:45, and he looked down and he says, "Oh, Bill," and he says, "Yeah." He says, "When you're playing the piano, would you sing that song for me, Precious Lord, and sing it real sweet? It's my favorite song." And Bill said, "Yes, sir, I'll do that, I promise." And then at 6:05, they were out in the balcony together, and King looked back in at Ralph, and he said, "Are you ready yet?" And Ralph looked out and said, "Yeah, I'm almost there. Let me put on some shaving cream, and I'll join you in just a second." And Jesse Jackson walked up the steps, and 5:07, they shook hands and said, "What's with Ralph?" Ralph's on his way, and a couple of other people gathered around, and Ralph walked out the door, and at 6:09, a shot rang out, 30-06 rifle from the building across the way, and it hit King right in the throat, fell back against the wall, collapsed to the ground. Ralph grabbed him and cradled his head in his lap, King's head in his lap. Someone got a towel and pushed the towel up against the wound. He couldn't talk. He could barely even breathe. And they called for an ambulance for someone to come and get him. And so there they were, the two of them, his lifelong buddy, holding his closest friend in the world in his lap, and watching the life just bleed out of him. And he said later on that King couldn't speak, he said, of that occasion, just couldn't talk. However, something in his eyes began to speak things that were close to real words, and they talked. He said something like, "This is as far as I can go. I've been to the mountaintop, but I can't go any further." And Ralph said, "What do I do now?" And he said that King's eyes said, "Don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Don't ever, ever, ever give up." It's nice to know that he was one of us, that his life was so bathed in the Christian message and so committed to the Holy Spirit. It's good to know that there were horrific, bloody, gory tortures of human beings back then. that we can change because of. But it's great to know that we should never, ever, 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 ever stop working for that dream. The dream of bringing in the outsider that Jesus did, the dream of building the mountain of God where everybody has enough to be fed with, the dream of neither Jew nor non-Jew of Paul. Don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. Don't ever. Amen.